Cindy here. It's Tuesday, so coming back once again for some Tuesday treasure from this week's Presence Driven Life podcast episode, which was with my son Justin, which was super fun. Anyway, what I felt like the Lord highlighted, what I wanted to talk about actually has to do with the title of the podcast. It was called Lest You Forget. And that came from, if you haven't listened to the podcast, you might want to, because it was really awesome. My son did a great job and has a lot to say that I think would be relatable to so many. But anyway, he shared about a dream he'd had where he gets a lot of God dreams. And this was one that was repeated in a particular night, morning, kind of twilight time. And the Apostle Paul came to him and said, the only thing he said was, lest you forget. And then that happened again. He said maybe even 3 times. But anyway, so when he got up, he's like, lest you forget, what the heck is that? So he went to the Bible app and he looked up lest you forget. And the first verse that came up was Deuteronomy 6:12. And this is how it reads: beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And that's just such a great reminder. It was, again, if you haven't listened to the episode, totally relevant to the things he was sharing and how the Lord was just planting something deep in his mind and heart about the power of remembering and gratitude. We all are still in process. We all have a lot going on in our lives, a lot of things that probably aren't as we would like them to be, both in terms of circumstances and often our own reaction to circumstances. But lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. Remembering is so powerful when remembering is in the context of looking back at God's deliverance. Now, there's a lot of exhortations in the Bible about not looking back. Now, that's not looking back in regret, not looking back in shame, not looking back and carrying the heaviness of that bondage from Egypt. But we do want to look back and see the Lord's deliverance. And again, to me, really what this speaks of more than anything is gratitude. It's remembering who God is, remembering what God's done. And as we look forward with the assurance, the remembrance, the gratitude, the thankfulness for all of his past faithfulness. If you want to talk about a book about that is so in alignment with this, I love the book of Philippians. I'm actually writing a little devotional on it right now. And when I was writing the first chapter, I landed on verse 3 of the first chapter. And it's where Paul said, I thank my God every time I think of you. And he was talking to the Philippians and how grateful he was for them, for their friendship, for their ministry. And I just remember looking at that and thinking, there's a lot of times I'm grateful, but I don't always thank God every time I remember someone, every time I remember who he is. I should, but I don't always. And as I was pressing into that, the thing about Philippians, most of you may know, Paul wrote Philippians when he was confined to prison, and yet Philippians is considered the epistle of joy. It's amazing. It's this book about the real life application of joy in the darkest, most dismal circumstances you could imagine. Talk about being in bondage. Paul, in the natural present tense, was in bondage, but because he had a joyful heart of gratitude, that every time he thought of the things of God, every time he thought of the provision of God in his friends and relationships, he thanked God. That is why Paul was able to find joy in a dungeon. Literally, it's like his body may have been in bondage, but his mind, his heart, his spirit were completely free, and they were free because of gratitude. And I don't know about you, but this past week for me, super intense, and it would be really easy to get under the circumstances. But honestly, I didn't have the luxury of getting under them. And that gave me understanding for Paul, because like I said, when I read that, every time I think of you, I give thanks. I don't give thanks every time. But sometimes there are circumstances that are so heavy and so adverse that you don't have the luxury of failing to remember who God is. You don't have the luxury of failing to look up. You don't have the luxury of forgetting an attitude of gratitude. Because if you do, you're going to sink like a lead balloon like that. And so that really was something that I felt like the Lord just pointed out to me in Philippians. Paul gave thanks every time because Paul didn't have the luxury of wallowing in his circumstances. Paul had to stay above them. And like I said, this past week, that's been a lesson to me. It's like, have I been perfectly at peace or perfectly in alignment with God every minute? No. But have I maintained an attitude of gratitude? Yes. Not because it was easy. No, because it was essential. And that's really what I want to say. The exhortation that the Lord gave Justin is an exhortation to all of us, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, who brought you out of bondage. Guys, the harder your circumstances are, the more difficult they are, the worst day you could have, the worst season you could have, that's where gratitude has to shine all the brighter. That's where we have to look up and not forget the Lord who brought us out of Egypt, the Lord who brought us out of bondage, because the one who did it once will do it again. And that's the point, guys. When we remember we are seated in heavenly realms with Christ, we are seated in that place where we are not praying for victory, we are praying from the victory that has already been won. Is this denial of circumstances? Heavens no. It's acknowledging a greater reality that has trumped our circumstances. And when every time we remember, every time we give thanks, we join him in that place of victory. Even though we're seated in heavenly realms with Christ always, that's what Ephesians says. We're not always aware of it, and we're not always living from that place. But when we look up, when we remember, when we give thanks, we live in that victory. And the more we live in that victory, does it change your circumstances in a heartbeat? It didn't for Paul. It hasn't for me yet, but it has changed me. It's changed my heart. It's changed my outlook. It's changed my attitude. It's changed my expectation. Because I expect good. He's been faithful before, he'll be faithful again. That's not just for me, that's for you too. And so, Jesus, I pray you would reveal your faithfulness to those who love you, those who need you, and that's all of us this week, this day, and every moment. In your name, amen. Bless you guys. Have a great week.